Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third in the series of Sam Proctor lectures, which memorializes Sam Proctor, who was both a historian and a person of historic importance to the University of Florida. And my name is Tony Rosenbaum. I am the Interim Director of the Graham Center. And on behalf of the Graham Center, I also want to welcome you. And I also want to introduce to you Mike Bowen, who is our Associate Director and who will be introducing Paul Ortiz. I want to also call your attention to another event that may interest many of you. This coming Friday, Senator Graham will be here speaking at Pugh Hall at 5:30 p.m. His subject will be growth management, and sustainability in a distressed economy. A very appropriate title, unfortunately. And you certainly are invited to come here, same place, different time. I'm going to turn the podium over to Mike. Just want to say that Mike is one of those people who has been so terribly valuable in making the program of the center work and has been particularly helpful in arranging for the Proctor series. And without his help, I don't think we would have been able to do nearly as well with the planned social activities and public activities we have had during the semester. And I want to be sure that he gets a sufficient appreciation. Okay, Mike?
As Tony said, thank you all for coming. This is the last event in the Proctor series, which was a series of 3. This is also the last of our 8 Graham Center public events this semester. So those of you who have been here before, thank you for your continued attendance, and it's good to see everyone out tonight braving the cold weather. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Paul Ortiz, who is in his first year as the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program here at UF, located just above my left shoulder. Paul comes to us from the University of California at Santa Cruz, where he was in the Department of Community Studies. He received his PhD from Duke in 2000 in American history, and his most recent book is entitled Emancipation Portrayed: The Hidden History of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920. Paul will be speaking to us tonight talk titled Building on Sam Proctor's Legacy, Race, Politics, and Freedom in Florida. So again, thank you all for coming, and I give you Dr. Paul Ortiz.
Thank you, Mike. And I just wanted to echo Tony's comments about the real hard and creative work that Mike has done. It's this semester at the Graham Center, and it's a real pleasure for us at the Oral History Program. We're up on the 2nd floor of Pugh Hall to be able to work so close with our colleagues in the Graham Center. And I see many repeat audience members. I know some of you have come out for previous events that either the Oral History Program or the Graham Center has sponsored. And you know that by now this building has really become a hub of activity, of scholarship, of intellectual interaction, and really exciting discussions about public policy and history. So it's a real just pleasure and honor for me to be able to work here. So at the outset, I do have a confession to make, and the presentation I'm going to be making this evening is actually somewhat different than the one I'd planned to give a few months ago when I was first asked to speak with you this evening. Between early September and November 4th, a lot of things have changed in Florida and in this country. So I've been asked to modify my presentation a little bit, so I'll get to that. But tonight, I really wanted to get us to think about the context of the historical context of doing oral history, or really doing any kind of historical work in today's day and age, in terms of both the history of the United States, in terms of the global economy, in terms of the economic situation that we're in right now. We live in a time of profound change, and really what better place to be than a place like this, a place like the Oral History Program, because oral history is not just about documenting or digging up or dredging up history, it's about documenting the moment that we're living in. And so one of the projects that the Proctor program is just embarking upon is to do a kind of documentary oral history project about folks who volunteered to work with political campaigns in Alachua County. This could be folks who worked with the McCain campaign, the Obama campaign, the Nader, the McKinney campaigns, because we wanted to start building a historical record for folks about what it meant to be alive in this day and age, what it meant to be a historical actor or actress in 2008. So we are especially well placed to document the present. And thanks to digital technology today, we can really get those interviews out into the public eye. Interviews we conduct today with World War II veterans and civil rights activists will be accessible not only to scholars, as they were in the past, but to high school students. Say a high school student doing a report on World War II in Ocala or Palatka can now, thanks to digital technology and the incredible hard work of folks in the library, they can have access to our interviews online to finish their book report or their special research project. Whether you're in Palatka, Ocala, Jackson County, or Beijing, China, now you can have access to the interviews that we've done both this year, but also even back to the beginning of the program that Sam founded. So today, I want to talk briefly about the mission of the oral history program. And that mission can be really boiled down into three essential tasks. Number one, gathering history, going out and doing the oral histories. Number two, preservation, preserving those tapes, preserving those audio envelopes. And number three, making this history accessible today or as soon as humanly possible. And I really want to emphasize these points because this is part of what we mean by building on Samuel Proctor's legacy. Because Sam really set us in this direction. He really kind of he created this incredible program and he passed down a lot of lessons. And so tonight I'd like to divide my presentation up into three sections. First, I'd like to use our revamped website to share with you where we are right now, some of the projects that the oral history program is working on. And in doing so, I want to invite each and every one of you to become a part of what we're doing, to become a part of building Samuel Proctor's legacy. And we honor Sam because we understand that he set for all of us a peerless example of scholarship, teaching, and service and commitment to the people of Florida. And there are many ways to honor his legacy. And I would submit to you that one of these is to become actively involved in programming and work at the Proctor Oral History Program. And we're always looking for ideas, for feedback, for volunteers. So I invite you to check us out, if not tonight, at a later point. In the second part of my presentation, I'd like to discuss this question of race and freedom in Florida. And I will also try to give you my very brief take on some of the intersections of race and freedom in Florida and the historic election victory of Barack Obama. And I'd like to conclude this evening by just very briefly touching on a most remarkable book of American history. And that book is Samuel Proctor's biography of Florida Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. And I actually found a copy of this book. The library, the main library here, unfortunately, the copy is lost, so I had to travel all the way to the law library, but it's good, it's still on campus. And it's titled Napoleon Bonaparte Broward, Florida's Fighting Democrat. It was published in 1950. This book was years ahead of its time. The character of Broward, the way that Dr. Proctor framed him, serves, I think, as a very instructive lesson for the politics of our own day and age. And so that's kind of how I will conclude. So first of all, what is the legacy that we are talking about this evening? Many of you are familiar with Samuel Proctor. Many of you were his colleagues. Some of you knew him quite intimately, but not all of us did. And so I will ask for your forbearance for a few moments while we do kind of a very quick run through of Sam's legacy. Professor Samuel Proctor founded the oral history program here in the University of Florida in 1967. And he really built this house brick by brick, and it also moved quite a bit too. It's hard to move a brick house. It's hard to move thousands of tapes, but Sam somehow found a way to do it. Along the way, of course, he served as university historian. He was the catalyst behind the founding of Jewish studies at UF. He founded many other programs here on campus. He promoted the study of Native American history, of Latin American history, and he was a beloved professor to literally thousands of students. And so right now, I'd actually like to do something to help us think about Samuel Proctor's legacy. I'd like us to think about our connections to Sam for just a moment. So first of all, and this is kind of an icebreaker in a way. So first of all, I'd like all the current and former staff members of the Samuel Proctor program to stand or to be recognized. How many of those folks are here? Deborah's doing the camera. There's Alan. Okay, no, you're supposed to stay standing. Don't sit down yet. Next, I'd like to ask all of Sam's former colleagues, professional colleagues, in any way or shape or form to stand. Now, I'd like to ask family and friends of Sam to stand. So this is part of Samuel Proctor's legacy, and I'd like the rest of us to acknowledge these fine folks. So Dr. Proctor's genius, and he was a genius, can be demonstrated and charted in many ways. When Sam passed away in 2005, there were many people who honored him. Some of you are actually in the audience this evening. Sam gave this university a history it never knew it had. And today, every time you read the seal, University of Florida, 1853, that's a big part of Sam's work. When he passed away, Ralph Lowenstein, former College of Journalism and Communications dean, noted, quote, "Virtually every plaque on every monument at the University of Florida was written by Sam Proctor. With Blair Reeves of the architecture department, Sam fought and won battles for preservation of the old buildings on campus." Now, can you imagine in this society of ours, as fast-paced as it is, having to fight to preserve history? Well, Sam was a fighter, and he engaged in that his entire life. UF history professor emeritus and former provost David Colburn said when Sam passed away in 2005, quote, "Sam is so much a part of this university's history, and he stood for all of the right things that you want a faculty member to stand for. He cared greatly for his students, and he stayed in close touch with them. And wherever I go, and Mike Denham is here this evening, but other of Sam's students that I've talked to all say the same thing, that Sam stayed in touch with his students over the years. He cared about their professional development and their individual growth. Professor Colburn goes on to say that Sam invested enormously in UF by participating in every major committee on campus, and the historic buildings would not be standing would not still be standing were it not for his leadership. No one has done more to advance the history of the state and the University of Florida. One of the most poignant tributes to Dr. Proctor was given by Michael Gannon. Dr. Gannon marveled, quote, "Who among us who raise pens or touch keyboards in service to Florida history has not known his guidance, his encouragement, his persuasion, perhaps even his goading?" Gannon described his dear friend as a, quote, "gentleman of the old school," someone whose professional ability and achievements were matched by personal qualities that, quote, "endeared him to us all, his generous spirit, his concern for others, his chivalry, his irrepressible good humor, his kindly wit." Samuel Proctor built one of the most remarkable oral history collections in the nation. Think about the depth and the diversity of the collection here at UF. And remember that the first major research project that Sam embarked upon in the late 1960s was an oral history project with Southeastern Indians. Now, it doesn't seem like much now, but at the time that Sam embarked upon this project, this was still during a time when US history, by and large, meant history told from the perspective of white European colonists. Sam, however, had a different and more democratic perspective on history. And when I look, whenever I read something that Sam has written, I'm always looking for that glimpse of his kind of democratic vision of what history could become with oral history. And I think of people like Archie Green, like Studs Terkel, these incredible storytellers who had a broad vision of American history, who saw American history not as a segmented, kind of isolated story of winners and losers, but a great kind of democratic mosaic and a society strong in its diversity. And so, for example, in our collection, we have interviews with kind of the movers and shakers of both Florida and U.S. history. We have interviews with General William Westmoreland. We have an interview that Julian Pleasance did with Senator George McGovern, really an incredible interview. We have interviews with people like George Smathers, Claude Pepper. These are the movers and shakers of Florida history. But Sam made certain that we also developed at the outset an emphasis in interviewing the non-elites, the ordinary people, like, us. So along with the governors and U.S. senators, we have African Americans who lived in the Fifth Avenue neighborhood in Gainesville. And this is a project that the oral history program embarked upon in the 1980s. Joel Buchanan, who works at the library now, did most of those interviews. Along with the interviews with people like General Westmoreland, we're very strong in interviews with rank and file troops from World War II. And a few of you actually attended. We had a Veterans Day public program on November 10th. We produced a film. Diane Fischler and Deborah, who's doing the camera right now, actually made this film titled I Just Wanted to Live. And this was a film that was based on interviews with 4 survivors of the Bataan Death March in the Philippines during World War II. And we had done those interviews years ago, and Diane was reading through them and picked those for their profundity and their clarity, and we actually produced a film about that. Had a wonderful event here. We had over almost 250 people. In fact, with Diane's permission, I actually, I'm going to pass around the memory book that we had from that event. Is that okay, Diane? And this just gives you some feedback from some of the veterans who attended, as well as the family members of some of the panelists. So you get a glimpse of that. So it's very important to think about, because there are some oral history collections which are really much more specialized in terms of the segments of society that they focus on. But Sam started a program and developed a program, then of course Julian Pleasance carries this on, of really developing a program that it's very deep and very diverse in terms of the types of interviews that are collected. There's a lot of people that we could thank for this. One of the people who we should thank, who unfortunately isn't here this evening, is Roberta Peacock, who's been office manager for the program now for 27 years. And that continuity gives you a clue as to why we've been so successful. So we are lucky, I think it's safe to say, to live and work in a place that Samuel Proctor dedicated his life to. And speaking personally, I feel like I'm really the most blessed academic in the country to be able to work in such an amazing program where the staff and the students believe in their mission. And the mission is to gather and preserve and disseminate history. And what better job for a historian to be able to work in? So I'm really a lucky person. Not just here, but to be able to work with colleagues in the Department of History, African American Studies, Women's Studies, incredible programs here. We have an incredible library and archive that we built a very good working relationship with special collections. We have the nation's oldest historical society. We have a strong humanities council. We have so many individuals and communities in the state that have amazing stories to share with us. In short, we have almost all the tools we need to carry on the legacy of Sam Proctor. I say almost because we only lack one thing. What is it? Sam Proctor, that's right. And then you said it, I didn't say it. I'm not going to pass the hat this evening, but I'm just, it's kind of a subtle hint. But what is oral history, and what are we doing at the oral history program at the University of Florida? I'd like at this point to actually turn the floor over to Roberta Peacock, even though she isn't here with us, and asked Mike to play. This is an excerpt from an interview that the Gainesville Sun did with Roberta. Actually, some of you readers of the Sun might remember.
That's exactly what we do. We record history for
Do you want to just start that over, Mike? I have to do just a short introduction because I want to embarrass someone real quick. There was a story that came out in the Gainesville Sun about StoryCorps about a month ago. And you remember the beginning of that story featured the Lowensteins. And the Lowensteins actually are with us. And as part of that story, the Sun interviewed Roberta Peacock and asked her the question, what is oral history? And so this is the clip that we're going to play.
No, we record history. That's exactly what we do. We record history for many reasons, like I said, whether it be for researchers or just because you want to get the history of your family. And so it's the same type process that you would use if you were doing genealogy for your own family. Oral history is a way of gathering the past. It's a way of collecting information for future generations. You can have media like the Gainesville Sun, for instance, or publications, and you will write a history, but to get the actual voice of the person telling their story is what oral history is about. Of course, Gator history is really a lot of interesting stories, whether it be Robert Cade, who developed Gatorade, telling stories about his lab and not only concocting Gatorade, but also having a Friday night alcoholic type mixture and then riding his bike across campus and getting stopped by police, to stories of Florida politicians and their views, which some people might just think are dry type stories. And then we have stories of folks who are over on the Swanee River who sit there playing their guitar, telling folk stories. The largest portion of a collection is our Seminole collection. It's used in a lot of different ways. Once we have it into a interview and taped, we can use it for writing purposes, like for a media. Also, we can use it so that people who have not heard voices of family get to hear a grandfather or a grandmother's voice for the first time. That's one of the exciting things I like about oral history. We go out and collect oral histories for different purposes, whether it be that we're doing an actual project for Florida water management or for the World War II veterans. Also, sometimes we just do interviews that someone calls and says, hey, I have this neighbor who's 90-something years old and you've got to get his story. And so we go out and do those interviews too. Preserving the past, that's what oral history is about.
That's one thing. First of all, you got to accept something. That you're a prisoner of war. You have no rights. You've lost everything. No help has come. We haven't seen anything. We haven't gotten any food. We haven't gotten any reinforcements. We haven't got nothing. We're sold down the roof.
We are waiting for God only knows what.
On campus on the 23rd of October, StoryCorps, which is the national NPR recording of oral histories, will be on campus. They'll be at the Cultural Center near the museums. And then a few days later, they're moving to the public library downtown, the Alachua County Public Library. And what happens there is that people have signed up to do an interview. They bring their interviewer with them, and they get their story. If you have not touched base with StoryCorps at all, you should go online and listen to some of those stories. We're just like every other department on campus, and we've had significant budget cuts, and always looking for folks who have a little bit extra maybe, or if you don't have extra money and you want to volunteer your time, we love volunteers. We have 3 of them that have been here for over 10 years, volunteering their time working on oral history. So just check out our website, give us a call.
Okay. Okay, so that you can actually find that that video is still on the Gainesville Sun. And just out of curiosity, how many of you or did anyone participate with the StoryCorps project? I know the Lowensteins did. It's a very interesting theory about oral history, which tries to take it out of the academic context. But all of the interviews done in StoryCorps, a copy is given to the family that participates in the program. Then also another copy is given to the Library of Congress to access. And then the idea is that years and years later, kind of like the WPA project in the 1930s, that historians and scholars will be able to use those stories to kind of recreate what life was like in 2008. So what is oral history and what can it add to traditional archival methods of history? And this is a topic we could spend weeks and months upon, but I would just like to give you kind of a quick case study, and this is something that I use with my students and my oral history seminars. And Mike, if you want to cue the PowerPoint, that first slide, and just kind of freeze frame on the first slide. This is, and I don't have my glasses with me, so I can't read this for you. Hopefully most of you can see this, but this is a slide that recreates a marker that was dedicated to Dr. W.S. Stevens in Quincy, Florida. And those of you familiar with African American history in Florida will know of Dr. Stevens. He was a formidable figure in early 20th century Black life in the state. He was an enormously successful doctor. He set up his practice in Quincy at the turn of the century, became quite successful. When you read about him, you'll read about these things that he did, these achievements that he made. There's a school, and now it's actually a community center in Quincy that's named after him. And so he became quite a prominent Black citizen in the Jim Crow period, or the period of disenfranchisement. So this is the official story about him. And it follows a certain kind of narrative strategy. It's a very kind of straightforward narrative. And if you look at this, I took this off of actually the Department of State of Florida's website. And so this is kind of the official story. Now, I did a series of oral histories, and Dr. Stevens passed away around the time of World War II, but I did a series of oral histories with members of Dr. Stevens's family and also people who knew him in Quincy. And Mike, if you want to go to the next slide, here you're going to see how oral history complicates and makes the narrative much more complex and much deeper, and in some cases really profoundly or even shockingly different. Because when you start to read, what I've done here, I've really gone quite over the top, and I've actually filled in details which are missing from the official Department of State narrative. And I've done this not just with oral histories, but also using archival sources like NAACP correspondence, for example, between Walter White and W.E.B. Du Bois. Those of you familiar with U.S. history will know that Du Bois and White were both officials in the NAACP in the 1920s, and Walter White actually had contact with W.S. Stevens. And you'll see a much different story here thanks to oral history. You'll see a story that the state may not want to acknowledge because you'll see a story here that talks about state terrorism. And at a point after Stevens had been attacked physically by a white mob, for example, during the 1920 election, he was beaten near the courthouse in Quincy. He was forced by the sheriff of that county to sign an affidavit that he had not been beaten. And you can imagine being presented with this as a Black man in 1920 and what it would have meant for you to try to resist that kind of deep coercion. And so this is one of the things that oral history can do. And it's not saying that oral history is always more accurate, but it's saying that oral history makes a narrative much more complex. And it allows us to get away from state-centered histories. And this is one of the reasons why oral history has become such a major, important technique in a lot of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, for example, in South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also in Latin America, some of the Truth Commissions that have been held there. I have colleagues, Greg Grannon, who teaches at NYU history. Greg has taken part in interviewing some of the survivors of genocide in Guatemala. And so oral history has really become an increasingly highly used method of digging for history. So next, let's take a look at the Samuel Proctor Oral History website just to kind of see where we are now. And we'll just kind of quickly go over some of the programs. And also I want to do a quick practicum with you. Yeah, it should be an Internet Explorer. And this is our homepage, and so we give a welcome to the site. And Mike, if you want to click on the current and upcoming projects and scroll down just a little bit, you can see some projects that we're engaged in. Go to the top, Mike, real quick, thank you. So one of the things we did in early September, we took a team of graduates and undergraduates to the Mississippi Delta. We did oral histories with veterans of the civil rights movement in Indianola, Mississippi, which is a very interesting town. Indianola was the birthplace of the White Citizens Council. The White Citizens Council was kind of like, it's been described as kind of the gentleman's club Ku Klux Klan. These were not poor folks. These were wealthy, incredibly rich, privileged, powerful people in Mississippi who organized to try to stop the civil rights movement. And so we felt like going to Indianola was a really important thing to do. There's a lot of amazing stories there to learn from and to tell. One of the other projects you'll see, I like to put people on the spot. Professor Bob Ziegler is sitting right here, and he's helping us develop a labor, work, and social justice project in the Gulf South. And again, this kind of builds on an interest that Sam Proctor had, didn't always have the time to develop, but trying to get a diversity of interviews. Folks, and we're talking about going out and interviewing people that work in the docks, first-generation immigrants, but also other types of working people like teachers and faculty members at UF. We want to kind of kickstart a project that Sam really held dear to his heart, which was he tried to interview retiring or faculty members as they retired. And then over time, as the school got larger, that was harder and harder to do. We're trying to figure out a methodology for doing that. Another thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to promote the accessibility of our collections. And this is really kind of one of the last nuts and bolts things I want to show to you. But Mike, do you see on there on the side, there's a research tab. And I'm going to show you how easy it is to log in to our site and to use our collection. So click the research tab and then go down to the Samuel Proctor Oral History Archives Online. Click that. And then enlarge that window. And now you're in. This is a portal to thousands of oral histories that are online. And if you go to the very top of the page, there's some tabs up there, Mike, on the top, and you click Collections. And you scroll down just a little bit so we can get a larger viewpoint. Now you can see the diversity and the depth of our collection and how it's been built. And you cannot access all of our 4,000 and some interviews, but you can access actually many of them that have been digitized. And so this is one of the things that we're really trying to promote in the program is getting people used to using our work, the oral histories online. And it's much more effective than it was in the old cassette tape or reel-to-reel days, or even wire recording days when you would do an interview. The interview would sit on a shelf in a library, and if you were lucky, 20, 30 years from now, some enterprising student of history found that tape and actually did a thesis or a dissertation about that. I mean, that's a good thing. I'm not trying to diss grad students here, but we want to make the interviews more audience. And so the digital project, which folks like Jim Cusick and others in the library have helped us on, has really made our collection much more accessible. So thank you, Mike, I appreciate that. So now I'd like to talk a little more about the topic of race and freedom. for tonight for the balance of my remaining minutes. And I want to use it as a way to transition us into thinking about contemporary politics. You know, that is where we are now, or where we think we may be. And to get there, to get to what I'll call tonight the Obama moment, I'd like us to think for a few minutes about segregation and what racial segregation is, what it was, what it means, and really what it doesn't mean. And so the first thing I'd like us to take a look at is actually a slide on PowerPoint. It should be slide, I'm guessing, number 3. And this is a statement that was made by Governor Daniel Fowley in North Carolina. And as you kind of read over it, the reason I'm showing you this statement is to give you a sense about how powerful folks in the South justify segregation and disenfranchisement in the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. They don't use the types of words that we use now to talk about racism. They don't use words like, hatred. They don't use words like ignorance. They understand racism as being part of a social and economic system. So here you have a governor of a major southern state who is trying to talk to his peers, not in the South, but actually in the North. And he's trying to explain to them why segregation and black disenfranchisement is the best form of governance. And he uses a framework of economic globalization to a certain extent. In other words, he's saying, because we have this system, we can more effectively compete in the global economy, as it were. And labor is so cheap with us that we can hire Negroes for 50 cents a day, and our cotton fields can compete successfully with the world with the common grades of plots. Oh, and then by the way, most African Americans in North Carolina live in abject poverty. And the economic component of segregation is the thing I want us to really think about today. Now, if you could go to the next slide, Mike, takes us closer into Florida. This is a quote that appears in my book, Emancipation Betrayed. This is from a gentleman, Richard, I think he was one of the Longs, Richard Call Long. Long, of course, was an antebellum Florida governor. And here, this is during the 1884 gubernatorial race in Florida. And the setting is, he's talking to a group he's talking on the stump, literally. He's out and he's campaigning, and he's saying, this is what we're going to do if we win this election. We're going to hold a constitutional convention, and we're going to disenfranchise the blacks in Florida. This is how we're going to do it, and this is going to be the outcome. And again, the outcome is an economic outcome. This isn't about hatred, it's not about ignorance, it's not about all of the kind of surface things we use when we talk about racism today. It's a very instrumental way of organizing a society based upon the disenfranchisement of the mass of the working class of the time, the black working class. And this is actually from a long speech, which I found in the course of my research when I was a graduate student, and it goes on in the same kind of vein, which is essentially that segregation is in part an economic system. It's important for us to remember that segregation, like slavery, was a labor system, is a labor system. It involves taking surplus wealth from one part of a population, whether you're talking about the United States or any other part of the world where it's implemented, and redistributing those resources, i.e. labor power, the fruits of one's labor, one's property values, so on and so forth, to other parts of the society, to the dominant part of society. So segregation, like slavery, is a labor system. It's not exactly like slavery, of course. I mean, there's obviously a lot of profound differences, but it is also a labor system. And this is what a careful look at states like Florida and North Carolina will tell us when we go back to the 1880s and 1890s. The final slide I'm going to show you, Mike, if you want to actually go to the Word document, is about educational inequality and kind of the legacy of segregation in Florida. And what you have here is, and the source is Charles Johnson's A Statistical Abstract of Southern Counties. Of course, Johnson was a preeminent scholar at the time at Fisk University. He worked closely with folks in Tuskegee. He did a lot of social science surveys using U.S. Census, doing his own interviews. And you can see the expenditure in the schools in these selected counties. And I just did this up really quickly. And you can see the profound difference, of course, between expenditures per white pupil and expenditures per black pupil. And this is done relatively late in the period of segregation. The book is published in 1941, but actually these would be statistics from probably 1940, I'm guessing. You see the expenditure for white people, black people, average value of white schools, average value of black schools. And again, the thing I want us to think about is segregation as a system which again involves a redistribution of wealth and resources. In this case, a redistribution of resources away from black schools to schools outside of black communities. And the other thing to think about in segregation is that it's a cumulative system. This is just a snapshot, but a snapshot can be useful to a certain extent, but it's not useful if you only think about it as a moment frozen in time. You have to think about how these things play out over the years and in fact over the decades. In the 1940s, things are actually getting a little better in terms of educational inequality. If you do the same thing in 1930, 1920, the stark in some instances. And I think this is one of the reasons why the moment we live in is such an exciting moment. Because if you think about how bad the era of segregation was and what it meant to try to live and to survive through that period of time, and you think about Senator Barack Obama's campaign, it's quite a profound change in many ways. The word change is used quite a bit during this day and age. The problem that I have, though, with the analysis of Senator Obama's victory, however, is the way in which people try to make it seem ahistorical. Some folks in the media and even some academics almost try to cast it outside of history in a sense. Wow, what an amazing thing. Couldn't have even been imagined. How stunning, without any kind of precedent, trying to kind of make it seem so extraordinary that there's almost no explanation for it, in a sense. As a historian, that deeply disturbs me. I hate to use that word, deeply. I swore when I was a grad student I never used that word, that term, deeply disturbing. But it is disturbing in a sense, because if you think about it, Barack Obama did not come out of nowhere. And to the contrary, he comes from a very rich tradition of peoples who have fought and died for freedom in the Americas. He is an excellent example of the notion, the social construction of race, because different people see Barack Obama in different ways. Some people see him as a person that doesn't have race. Some people see him as a person who's all about race. Other people see him as a hybrid person, as a multiracial person. So again, it's a great example of a person who can teach us about the social construction of race. I mean, this is one of the reasons why it's so exciting to be a scholar of race these days. What I'd like to focus on right now is the group of people who voted for Barack Obama by an overwhelming plurality. That is 95, what we have right now in the exit polls is we're getting about 95 to 96% of African Americans voted for Barack Obama. And this is significant in part because it reminds us about one of the places that Barack Obama came from. Now, he comes from many different traditions, many different struggles, but one of them is in the African American experience writ large. We're talking about the black diaspora, the black experience in the Americas. And if you think about the Florida dimension to this story, we have to remember the many black Floridians who fought, in many cases died in total anonymity in this state, who prepared the way for Senator Obama. Now, we could do a whole semester on African Americans in Florida. I mean, there's a really deep and rich tradition of notable African Americans in the state. But I want to talk about a few for the next few minutes. Let's think about someone like Zora Neale Hurston, a sublime artist. Her magnificent novels upheld the dignity of all women. Her anthropological work defended the dignity of turpentine workers, phosphate miners, and sharecroppers. The truly forgotten Americans. We heard a lot about the forgotten Americans this campaign season. Who better documented forgotten Americans but Zora Neale Hurston? She died in poverty, and yet her literature is read by millions worldwide. As we marvel at the astonishing wit and grace of Michelle Obama, let us not forget perhaps the greatest Floridian of them all, Mary McLeod Bethune. A citizen of the world, a peerless educator. Her slogan was "Lifting as we climb," a very interesting watchword to live by. She was the founder of Bethune-Cookman College in Daytona and became an advisor to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Imagine that. She urged in 1920 Black Daytona, and I'm proud to say I found this, I put this in my book on Florida. In 1920, she organized a secret meeting she held on her campus, and she told everyone present, eat your bread without butter, but pay your poll taxes and vote. And she was that committed to breaking down segregation and one-party disenfranchisement. So I would present to you that Barack Obama stands on the shoulders of Zora Neale Hurston and Mary McLeod Bethune. Let's talk about a few more people. As we marvel at the politically engaged youth volunteers in the Obama campaign, let us also remember two young Black Floridians, Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore. In 1934, they organized the first NAACP county branch in Brevard County. They were school teachers dedicated to educational equality. They were also extraordinary political activists who knew the value of community organizing. Interesting how the term community organizing was bandied around this election. The Moores were community organizers par excellence. In the late 1940s, the Moores helped organize one of the most effective voter registration campaigns in the history of this country without using the internet. Without Blackberries, without text messages, they helped organize 100,000 Black Floridians to register and vote. In 1951, as they celebrated their 25th anniversary, this is after many years of being community organizers, over the Christmas holiday, they were assassinated by, we think, the Ku Klux Klan. And I'd like to submit to you this evening that Barack Obama stands on the shoulders of Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore. We could spend the rest of 2008 discussing African Americans in Florida who gave their all for freedom. We could talk about people like James Weldon Johnson, Reverend Howard Thurman, Eartha M.M. White, so many others. But for the sake of brevity, I'd like to just mention one more great Floridian and kind of lift him up for your cognizance, A. Philip Randolph. Let's think about A. Philip Randolph for a minute. So Randolph was born in 1889 in Crescent City. He was one of the most important labor leaders in American history. He was the founding president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a union that African American railroad workers created through 12 long years of struggle and sacrifice. They organized between 1925 and 1937. This was an epic organizing campaign. Most importantly, Randolph used the power and numbers of the Union to threaten a mass march on Washington in 1941 to protest against discrimination against Black workers in wartime industry factories. Now, President Roosevelt himself personally begged Randolph not to march, arguing that it would damage the U.S. war effort. Randolph calls off the march in return for a guarantee of a creation of a federal commission that would investigate job discrimination claims. Numerous members of this union go on to become pivotal civil rights activists and political leaders, including a gentleman by the name of C.L. Dellums. We know Ron Dellums becomes a major U.S. congressman, major progressive U.S. congressman from California. So fast forward to 1963. Randolph and a number of African-American labor leaders, including Bayard Rustin and Cleveland Robinson of New York's powerful District 65 union, plan a march on Washington. And this march is initially actually aimed not at President Kennedy of the US Congress, but it's originally aimed at the AFL-CIO. I actually have a colleague at the University of Wisconsin, Will Jones, who's doing a really amazing study of the March on Washington, and he's looking at the key organizers behind the march, including people like Randolph and Robinson and other folks. So you know that John McCain's campaign accused Barack Obama of being a socialist, right? And folks kind of judged that pro and con and made their decisions. Well, A. Philip Randolph was a lifelong socialist. And many of the rank and file organizers of the March on Washington were in fact socialists. And this is important because, again, the economic dimension of the march for jobs and freedom. Because they were socialists, many of them, like Randolph, were socialists, but they were also anti-communist at the same time. But they organized this march as an economic protest, largely, not just kind of an abstract, we shall overcome kind of thing, but a march for jobs and for freedom. Now, this is going to be slightly controversial, but I would submit to you that A. Philip Randolph is the one who ends up giving the most powerful speech that day in Washington, D.C. And in fact, his speech initially received far greater attention than Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And if you go back and you look at the first editions of the New York Times, the Post, Randolph is really, in many ways, the star of that event. And I like those of us that do Florida history to remember that. I think that's an important story. In his address, Randolph forcefully discussed the legacy of slavery as well as the economic aspect of civil rights. He asserted, quote, "The sanctity of private property takes second place to the sanctity of human personality." Now think about what this means. The sanctity of private property takes second place to the sanctity of human personality. It falls to the Negro to reassert this proper priority of values because our ancestors were transformed from human personalities into private property. So Randolph is not only drawing an economic philosophy, he's drawing in the history of slavery, and he's doing it in such a way to make that experience universal and to try to get people to think about what it means to subordinate human personality to the sanctity of private property. And he's making an argument that we need to kind of switch gears here in 1963. Why does he do this? He's concerned about deindustrialization in 1962. He's concerned about automation. And he goes on to say, it falls to us, the Negro, to demand new forms of social planning to create full employment and to put automation at the service of human needs, not at the service of profits, for we are the first victims of unemployment. So I would submit to you this evening that President-elect Barack Obama stands on the shoulders of A. Philip Randolph. People like Randolph prepare the way. They prepare a public space for people like Barack Obama, or even before him, Jesse Jackson in the 1980s. Because the other interesting thing is if you think about the election of Barack Obama, you think about this emphasis on community organizing, think about the two campaigns in 1984 and 1988, Reverend Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition. My wife did a lot of precinct walking for the Obama campaign. She was around the 1980s, and I've asked her this question, and you'll find that many of the volunteers in the Obama campaign were also volunteers for the Rainbow Coalition in the 1980s. Again, another example that Barack Obama doesn't just come out of nowhere. There's these long generations, these long traditions of community organizing and history that make his election possible. But again, the 50-something folks are folks that don't necessarily get in Time. They don't necessarily get in Rolling Stone. They're not really, sexy folks. They're like us. They're like 50 or 60-some age folks. So the last thing I want to talk about Barack Obama's election is this question of post-racial politics. So the question that I've been asked by folks in the media is, was Senator Barack Obama's victory an example of post-racial politics? First of all, let's think about what it would mean to live in a post-racial world. Now, I'm not sure that would be a very interesting world to live in. And we could spend a lot of time talking about this, and maybe I can talk about this during Q&A, but what would it be like to live in a post-racial world? Are you saying that there's no longer any space for Toni Morrison or Herman Melville or William Faulkner. I mean, these were great artists who their work at the core is everything about race and the dilemmas of race. So when we use that term, I just ask us to be very, very, very thoughtful about how we use the term. What would it mean to live in a post-racial world? Yes, it would be wonderful to live in a world without the inequalities that we see on the board, but holistically speaking, what are we going to give up and what are we going to gain by living in that kind of world? But back to reality. According to the exit polls, which I looked at CNN, continue to demonstrate the crucial role of race and class in the 2008 election. We know that Black and Latino support was crucial in Obama's victory in key states, including Colorado, New Mexico, and Florida. While 55% of white Americans voted for Senator John McCain, 67% of Latinos voted for Obama. And the day after the election, the Miami Herald breathlessly noted that Senator Obama was, quote, the first Democratic candidate to win Florida's Hispanic vote. Now, that's, of course, since 1980, since we started tracking that particular demographic and statistic. But we do know that the Hispanic vote helped Barack Obama to become the first Northern Democrat to carry Florida since Franklin D. Roosevelt. And if you wanted to find clues as to how that vote would trend, talking about the Latino vote, all you have to do is go back to 2006, March, April, and May. And you look at the labor insurrections that started happening in South Florida. You look at these incipient, in some cases, wildcat strikes. You looked at the May Day demonstrations against what Latinos define as racist immigration laws or the proposal of certain immigration laws. And you could see which way the wind was blowing. Back in 2006, of course, agricultural workers in Florida and other states were marching to express their opposition to U.S. House Resolution H.R. 4437, which at that moment threatened to turn undocumented workers and their supporters into felons. It would have been a felony offense to be caught helping an undocumented worker. That was the kind of the centerpiece of 4437. In fact, many observers compared 4437 House Resolution to the infamous Fugitive Slave Act. And I can remember at the time a lot of people making that comparison. So this election that we live in, or the election that we just had, demonstrates that we no longer live in a world where race is a black and white thing. From Florida to Washington State, Latino working class political power is on the rise. I don't have much time to talk about it this evening, but if you look at the indicators, increasing Latino membership in the major service unions where the economy is growing, one of the few places the economy is growing is in the service sector, the SEIU, Unite Here, AFSCME, and other unions. I was still living in the West Coast when the head of the Los Angeles County Federation of Labor, 1 million plus members, Maria Elena Durazo, came out and endorsed Obama during the Democratic primary. This is quite a historic announcement. You have the most powerful Latina leader in this country coming out, going out on a limb, and endorsing Barack Obama. It had an enormous ripple effect in the Southwest. But in the long term, not a very, not necessarily surprising endorsement. She grew up as a family, a migrant farm worker family. Her parents were members of the United Farm Workers. She learned her community organizing skills from Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. And I could go on and on to talk about the Hispanic vote, but I think I'm going to skip to the end here. I know we're running up on 8 o'clock. And just to make a few closing observations and then to talk briefly about Sam's book on Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. Political scientists now really have to ask the question, is Richard Nixon's Southern strategy officially at its end, at its endpoint? The Southern strategy, as you remember, is a strategy that was hatched in the Republican Party to draw white voters away from the Democratic Party. And for many years, this was seen as an incredibly successful strategy, but are we at the end of that particular historical period? Because in most parts of the nation, first of all, non-white voters are increasing in significance. The second question is how many white voters can the Republican Party continue to draw away from the Democratic Party? Perhaps they've drawn all that they're going to draw. But then the flip side of that is how many have they repelled or driven out of the Republican Party in the last 3 or 4 years through economic policies, embrace of Christian fundamentalism. And I know I'm criticizing the Republicans right now, but I do want to tell you, I do this in a spirit of friendship. I actually publicly endorsed a Republican candidate for state senate in Seattle, Washington. So he would agree with my analysis here. The Republicans have got a lot to do to kind of get themselves reorganized. I'm not going to give them any clues right now. As Sam frames him, Broward emerges as as kind of a tragic figure. He's an idealist. He tries to serve what he calls the common man by challenging corporate power in Florida. Dr. Proctor notes that late 19th century Florida was run by, quote, tycoons. And if you read Sam's scholarship, you'll know that this was an ongoing concern of his, was the impact of corporate control in Florida. In Florida, as in many other southern states, Dr. Proctor continues, quote, political and economic supremacy was maintained to a great extent through subsidized legislatures, controlled elections, and political puppets as civil officers. Sounds like a third world country, right? Not the United States. But long after the end of Reconstruction, as Sam continues, quote, the corporate and railroad interests dominated the state politics of Florida. And this is the milieu that Napoleon Bonaparte Broward comes into to try to change, to try to reform. And when you read the record, and you read like correspondence to governors, you read newspapers, you read private manuscript papers, you see this great theme in Florida history, and it's a theme of struggle between different competing political and economic interests. One writer from Federal Points, his name is J.F. Tenney. Some of you familiar with Florida history will know J.F. Tenney was. He was mayor of Federal Point during Reconstruction, a remarkable character. He was a white man. He was against black and disenfranchisement. He was against white supremacy. He was against Jim Crow. He observes in 1892, where would the land come from to subsidize railroad and bogus canals? The state couldn't grab it from the poor man's acres. Blast the expenses. These poor devils are of no account anyhow. And this is a constant theme, the loss of land among small farmers to railroad interests. So Napoleon Bonaparte Broward comes on the scene to help people like J.F. Tenney. And Dr. Proctor makes it clear that Broward is a progressive politician. That's his kind of political tradition. But the tragedy of Broward's life is a deeply American tragedy of the Gilded Age of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It's not just a Florida tragedy. It's not just a Southern tragedy. It's a national tragedy. Because in reality, the only political force that could have successfully served as a counterbalance against the type of interests that Broward was fighting against would have been an interracial coalition of white and black citizens. And this is something that Broward could not affect, he could not do, because by this time, one-party rule is pretty much a fact. And the electorate is cut by a full half. The working class electorate is cut by a full half or even more. Broward endorses one-party white supremacy. He cuts his base of support. He lauds the common man frequently, but he makes clear that by the common man, he means white people. And as you get this trend throughout Southern politics, as interracial politics disintegrates across the South, so too did the possibilities of building kind of genuine small d democracy in the region. And the politics of Florida in the late 19th, early 20th century really take a terrible slide. Florida becomes notorious for its turpentine camps, as well as its phosphate mines and convict labor systems. The state even acquires the dubious title of the American Siberia. Broward, thank God, did not live long enough to see his fierce and hated rival, U.S. Congressman Frank Clark, ascend into political power. Because Clark is a person who represents that other wing of Florida politics, the pro-corporate wing. He's the one who, whenever there's an investigation into debt peonage in Florida, Clark is the one who steps up and says, oh, there's no debt peonage in Florida. So really to conclude here, I think it's important to remember that Sam's biography of Governor Broward gives us a number of choices and a number of examples. The lessons in this book are quite amazing. One is that you cannot engage in a campaign of political change by leaving half of the population behind. If you're concerned with economic justice, you must be concerned with racial justice as well. Questions of the natural environment as well as justice to Native peoples must be integral concerns. Sam talks a lot about drainage. And of course, drainage is coming back, and we know the impact it had on Native Americans in South Florida. Finally, it takes a coalition to change things. So in conclusion, thank you for being patient this evening. I think we still have much to learn from Sam Proctor, and I think we should all dedicate ourselves to building on his rich legacy in Florida. Thank you. Thanks.
Paul, would you take a few questions?
Sure.
Okay, if there are any questions from the audience, the microphone is open.
Yes, Dave.
Kind of Sam Proctor noted with his Napoleon Bonaparte Broward when he wrote it. He was not a PhD historian. He did not have his doctorate yet. And so he was writing his dissertation on the exciting subject, the early days of the University of Florida. In those days, the old tradition was that you defended your dissertation on an open forum, and anyone could come in and ask questions. So Alan Severs came by my office. You remember Alan Severs? For some of you. And Alan says, come on, we're going to go examine Sam Proctor. And I was teaching a seminar on the age of Darwinism, and at many universities, particularly in the South, as much as your job was work, to say anything in favor of Darwinism and certainly teach it. And so I asked Sam, what was the response to Darwinism of the University of Florida campus? And he said, none.
Wow. Okay. Thanks, David.